Hello and welcome to another Atomic Geekdom author interview. I'm Matt. Obviously, normally Jenny's here with me, but I was just saying to my guest today, when this email came across our emails, Jenny went, actually, I haven't read any of his books yet. And I went, oh, me, I've read all his books and I really enjoy them. So yes, I'll happily have a chat with him. He has been around, you may remember, way back in the early days of the internet. He was the former executive editor of crack.com, which is where his first book actually came from, and we can talk a little bit about that. And he is the author of 6 novels. He has the best names for his novels. I'll get into that in a little bit. And his 7th one is about to come out, which is one of the things we are going to talk about. He is the artist formerly known as David Wong. These days, he just wants you to call him Jason Pargin. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh,
And
yes.
we were saying this before we got on here. I have so much appreciation for everybody still doing a show where you talk to authors and where people can find out about books, because there are not that many left, because there's not much of an economic model for doing
No.
it. And there's so many used to keep a list of all the people I've talked to for previous books over
Mhm.
the years, and that list is 99% dead shows and dead
Wow.
publications. And because there used to be all these blogs and all these people where would interview you, and they're all gone because
Mhm.
there's no way to make money from it for so many people. So
Sure.
the ones that are soldiering on and doing it for the love of it, you're not getting rich off of it. I
No, no.
assume maybe you are. I
No,
don't know your
no, we know.
situation,
No.
but most people are doing it. They're doing it because they love reading. They're huge fans. They just want to talk to authors.
Mhm.
And for authors to be able to get the word out, you need stuff like this. And it's easy to do if you have a movie out, if you have a book out. There are precious few outlets left. So, those of you
Yeah.
listening to this, however you support these shows, please do it, because it is crucial and hugely underrated for authors, especially. I'm, of course, a big shot now, but for indie authors, new authors,
Mhm.
getting the word out and having somebody you can talk to in depth about your book, about your career,
Yeah.
that's everything. And there's so few places to do it now.
Yeah, well, we only recently started really getting into book reviews and talking to authors because Jenny and I, we just like to talk about books. And then it so happened that our first one, Jonathan Mayberry, we were just big Jonathan Mayberry fans. And she was like, let me reach out. He's got a book coming out. Let me see if we can get him to talk to. And then it turns out that, we could, and now we're doing it more. And books are showing up at my door now that I didn't even ask for, which is amazing. I got 2 recently. I get home and there's packages on the doorstep. I'm like, I didn't order anything, and then I see that they're from St. Martin's or whoever they were from, and I was just like, oh, more books to read, to review. And
Because there's
yeah.
publishers out there saying, oh my God, there's somebody still talking about books on a
Right.
show. Send them all of the books, send them all of the preview copies.
Yep.
There's somebody still doing it, still soldiering on.
Yeah, I recently, and we don't need to talk about this, but I'll just bring it up just because you know um I this year wrote my first book, and I'm in the process of editing it, and now I'm at the part where I'm also like, shoot, now I got to figure out, number one, how am I going to publish this? Number two, how am I going to let people know it exists once it's published?
I think it's relevant what we're going to talk about, because I got my start publishing online. I gave my
That's
book
very
away
true.
for free for 5 years. And
Mhm.
today I'm a full time author, but that means that my schedule is 80 to 85% promotion,
Yep.
15 to 20% writing fiction,
Yeah.
because writing the book is very hard. Also, it's not the hard part.
No.
Getting people to hear about it in this media environment is what's hard. So
Mhm.
I have some people, if people who have heard of me already, they most likely have not heard of me from my books. They've heard of me from TikTok. I have a
Okay.
325,000 followers or something like that. That is not something I'm doing just to amuse myself. That is how I reach people and let them know there is a book coming, because the mechanism by which you can let people know a book is coming is very difficult. It is a landscape that is incredibly crowded, and you have an audience that has an infinity of things they could be doing other
Mhm.
than reading your book.
Yes, that's
So
very true.
yeah,
Well, yeah, and we can talk about it a little bit just for anybody that's tuning in, who has not heard of Jason. Maybe you just like our author interviews and you're checking this one out. Number one, go ahead and pick up Jason's books. They're all really good and really funny. But your first book, John Dies at the End, like you mentioned, you had it up on it was on Cracked, right? Just you would put it up a little bit at a time and see about feedback.
even predates Cracked. We're talking going
Okay.
back to the early 2000s, maybe 2001, 2002. I had just a blog on one of the blogging platforms
Mhm.
at a time before the word blog existed. Because in those days, you're talking about 2002, you're talking about a time when it was the first time most households had an internet connection, but it was probably close to 50-50, where most people in America still did
Mm.
not have internet.
Mhm.
So I was one of those people. And back then, a web page was just whatever you put on it. It was just a page with text. You could only do text. A photo would take 7 or 8 minutes to load. There
Yeah.
was no such thing as video or audio. So at the time I had this blog, that's where the David Wong username came from, because back in those days, everybody was publishing under a pseudonym. It was back in the early hacker days of the internet. So
Mhm.
everybody had, you would just see, you'd read a very thoughtful, long blog article, but then the name of the author was like Demon Sword 187. Like,
Right.
and so in my case, I had started way back then writing online, just essays and poems, anything. But I also was writing this short story, these horror stories that just came out a little bit at a time. And then the protagonist was named David Wong. And in the story on the first page, he's a white guy who has picked that as a pseudonym because he thinks it'll make it harder for his enemies to find him, because Wong is the
Yes.
most common surname in the world. So he has this genius idea. And then you realize, oh, he's an idiot, because everyone immediately asks him, that's why do you have that name? Were your parents Chinese? Like, so it's
Yeah.
just establishing that he's a dumbass. Well, when the stuff was written, it was written as the character in the
Mhm.
story, Dave. Just that, because back then, you could totally separate yourself from what you were writing. You were totally anonymous. So you could go to your day job and not know that you had this whole other life online and you had fans. And over time, I started to grow a group of fans. Like, this story went viral. So that I just posted it for free, making no money from it.
Mm.
This went on for years. And then from there, it was in around 2006, 2007. I had started self publishing it, just because people were messaging me saying, "Hey, I've printed out your story so far, but it's really cumbersome. I've got it on like a 3-ring binder. Do you have a print version?" So I was
Yeah.
like, I guess I can. So I went through a print on demand service, and then an indie publisher came along and they did like a $500 advance to publish a few thousand copies of it. And then from there, one of those wound up in the hands of a famous Hollywood horror producer director, and he
Mm.
bought the film rights from that. Like, at that point, I had no agent, no publisher, no editor.
Wow.
I had never done any of that stuff. He emailed me cold, like, had to try to look up my email address to say, "Hey, I want to make a movie
Wow.
out of this." So then that same year, 2007, I got the job at Crack writing full time. But prior to that,
Okay.
and the entire time I was writing John Dies at the End, I was just working a day job at an insurance company,
Mhm.
and not writing creative copy or anything. I was just doing data entry. I was making $11 an hour to enter like insurance claims into a computer,
Okay.
which was a decent job. I'm not acting
Sure,
like that's
sure.
my rough, scary background. It was it's a job a lot of people would love to have. It
Well, and
had air conditioning.
back in the 2008 days, anybody listening now is like $11 an hour. Back in the 2008 days, that was pretty decent, you know?
And they treated me well. So I never, I try to, it's funny talking about my background, because I try to make it clear that I didn't like come up through a writer scene. I'm not, I didn't live in New York. I didn't work at a publishing house. I didn't come up through as, an editor's assistant or something like that. I didn't have an English degree. I
Mm.
wasn't aspiring to be an author. I was just a guy. I had graduated with a degree in broadcast journalism that I wound up not using, and I was just taking odd jobs. Like that insurance company I got through a temp agency, and I was just working to
Yeah.
pay the bill. So that was my day job. Just I had 2 jobs. I worked there, and I worked at a law office in the evening doing their billing and stuff. But it was just two office jobs that I was trading back and forth, two part-time office jobs, and then at night and on weekends I was writing just whatever came into my head. And this story I wrote, a story called John Dies at the End, again the joke being that it's telling you what happens at the end of it.
Yeah.
It kind of went viral back when things like that could, back when a 150,000 word text document online could go viral as a piece of content people were sharing,
Mm-hmm.
because there were no such thing as podcasts back then. There was no YouTube.
Right.
I know I'm talking about like this was 1943, but the people under a certain age cannot
It's
comprehend the world before the internet.
exactly. It's pretty wild the rapidity at which the technology has changed everything, So
And that's answering one of the most common questions I get, because even doing the show, the first thing people ask, because I do not doubt we have aspiring authors listening to this, because that's who seeks out interviews with authors, like how did they
true.
do it. And so they asked me, well, what would you do? It's like what you would do in 2023 bears no resemblance to what, like, I would probably release it as a piece of audio now. I would put it up on YouTube, where I could put up
Mm-hmm.
clips on TikTok, or you'll go to where people are now. But back
Bad
then,
idea.
the internet was for nerds, and
Mm-hmm.
it was text only. Everything was text only. So now there's a whole like ripe ecosystem of fan fiction, and Wattpad and AO3 and all of these sites that are just an entire ecosystem of amateur writers doing fanfic or doing whatever.
Yeah.
Where now I think where a lot of authors come from. When I got started, that didn't exist. Like the idea of writing a novel online, I had never heard of anyone doing that. I'm not saying I was first. I'm just saying that it wasn't a known thing. And for publishers, it definitely wasn't a known thing. So I have never done any of the traditional stuff. I've never written a query letter. I've never gone out
Oh,
shopping for
okay.
an agent. The way it happened was I was a guy working at an insurance company who on the side wrote a story that went viral. A Don Coscarelli, a horror producer
Yep.
director, bought the film rights, and then St. Martin's, one of the big five publishing houses, came to me and said, "Well, can we should do a hardcover release of this thing," and we had to negotiate the rights away from that publisher that I had sold it to.
Mm-hmm.
We did a hardcover release, and then they were like, "Now, do you have an agent?" I was like, "No. Where do you find an agent? Do you know any? Like, how do you do that?"
Yeah.
So then I had to go to an agent and say, "Hey, I don't need you." It's like I already have a book deal. I already have a movie deal. I need you to look at the paperwork. like this is the easiest agent stuff you're ever going to have. It's so all the advice is like, well, how do you sell yourself to an agent? How did you convince? It's
Sure.
like I walked in saying, I need somebody to look at this contract. I don't know what I'm looking at,
Mm-hmm.
and negotiate it for me. So I did everything backward, but it was extremely fortunate. So
Right.
the point I was trying to make before is I'm fortunate in that sense. I'm not fortunate in the sense that like my dad was a best-selling author and he got me this. Like I
Sure,
had no
you
connections.
just had to you sure, and happy accidents do happen. It's like the old myth, the old Hollywood myth. You're gonna get off the bus and somebody's gonna say, "Hey, you look great. Let me make you a star." It's the whole idea of you did something you loved and it just happened to connect with people and people enjoyed it and that. So yeah, happy accident, which is awesome. And I love that. And it's pretty awesome that you got to go on and write more of those stories. So I love that story, actually.
Oh, and I did a lot of press at the time because the movie came out in 2012, and I
Mhm.
got to fly out to Sundance with the cast, and they did Q&A when, they're treating me like one of the famous people. And I did a lot of press at the time, like this overnight success story. And it's like, well, I started writing in 1998, and it
Yeah.
took, I gave it away for free for 5+ years, and then sold it as an indie, self-publishing, and
Yep.
then an indie press release, if it's selling 4 or 5 copies a week. It's like if you ground away at a task for 9 straight years without earning barely a penny from it, I don't know that that's still overnight success. Like,
No.
like the success arrived all at once, but I had to learn how to write novels. And the way I learned how to write novels is I went on the internet and started writing a novel,
Hmm.
because I was so, they hook it up for me in 1998 or whenever I got my first connection on AOL. It's like, oh, I can type anything and the words just appear on the screen for anyone to read. All right,
Yeah.
I was born at just the right time to take advantage of this because it was getting that on the ground floor. I was one of the first people, among the first people on earth, making stuff for the internet.
Yeah.
There was hundreds of thousands of us, but still, considering that, like, now, there's 3 billion internet users or whatever. At the time, it's like, no, I was on the bleeding edge of producing stuff for the internet. And that, if I had come along 10 years before or after, maybe none of this happens. So that
Yeah.
in itself is fortune.
That's true. Now, I did mention it at the top. I just want to let everybody know you, number one, you do, well, the John Dies at the End series is horror comedy. But your titles, straight off the bat, one of the things I always love is when I pick up one of your new books and I read the title, you're like the king of titles. John Dies at the End. This book is full of spiders. Seriously, dude, don't touch it. Futuristic violence in fancy suits, which, boy, I love that title. What the hell did I just read? Zoey punches the future in the dick. And if this book exists, you're in the wrong universe. And of course, your new book that is about to come out is called Zoey is Too Drunk for This Dystopia, which again is just fantastic. So you have just a sense of humor that is just, even right in the title, your sense of humor and just how you are going to approach the story is right there, right from the get-go.
And again, that violates a lot of rules of book titles. You're supposed to keep them short.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's something in book marketing that ideally a title would be like 2 words
Yeah.
or 3 words, something like that. And so my titles are an entire sentence. But this is where, if there's a lesson here, is that any rule somebody tells you in terms of something that's creative, like, here's what's selling right now. If you're dealing with a creative field, there's always an advantage in breaking those rules. Like, you should immediately think, okay, is there something in, doing it totally wrong? So having a book called, what the hell did I just read? Or if this book exists, you're in the wrong universe. That's, what is that, like 11 words?
Yeah.
That's a long title. It's hard to fit it on the book. But also, there was a time not too many years ago, they would not allow you to put profanity in the title of a book. Whereas now,
Mhm.
if you go to the self-help section, 80% of the books have the F word in the title. They've just got it
That's
censored
true.
out. So things like that, of like having a goofy title or a title that's too long or whatever, that can make you stand out. But I didn't do it to stand out. I did it because I just thought, well, you can at least make somebody laugh when they see it on the shelf. Like, even if they can't afford to buy the book, they'll get 2 seconds of amusement reading, like, oh, this book's actually called John Dies at the End. It's just telling me. And now there are multiple books that are some version of the character dies at the end. I'm not saying they stole the idea, but it's now not an original idea anymore. That's what I'll say.
Sure. And it's just, with original ideas, when we talk about how you can make things your own, obviously the idea of a spooky town, which you focus on in John Dies at the End, John and David, they live in undisclosed, which is a spooky town, but you do it in a way where this is a spooky town that is a national reputation for being a spooky town. It's on the government's radar. There's always, mysterious, shady characters coming in to try and stop John and David from messing everything up. And so it's just another way in which, what am I trying to say? You take an old concept, and go, no, let's look at this way and make it this, and it works just so well. Um, so that's what I was trying to get at there.
Well, like, small town horror has always been a thing, and even like Stranger Things didn't borrow the idea from me. Like,
No,
that goes
yeah.
back to the Stephen King tradition of, these small towns
Mhm.
in New England or whatever. Because small towns, especially writing in Stephen King's prime, in the 70s or 80s, these places truly felt isolated. And pre telecommunications, pre cell phones, pre
Yeah.
internet, a small town, you felt like you were on an island. You're so disconnected from where the culture happens, from where world events happen. So
Mhm.
they're always perfect for this kind of cosmic horror, because the idea is, if there is some small town in the middle of, and it doesn't even specify what state they're at, but if it's in the middle of Ohio or Indiana or whatever,
Mhm.
that something like that could be happening, and the rest of the world wouldn't necessarily know. And so it's less true today as the series has gone on. Like technology, it feels like if an actual monster emerged from, an abandoned coal mine somewhere in Appalachia, that there would be a million cell phone cameras capturing it for TikTok.
Yeah.
So we usually are forming some reason why that doesn't happen. But what you're trying to maintain is this idea that nobody's coming to help you and nobody cares what happens to you. And this has been a thing that, as these books have gone along and as what has happened politically in America since 2015 has happened, more and more people who talk to me in more and more interviews kind of focus on the concept that John and Dave are from red America, from what
Mm.
would now be Trump country, because it's rural, it's economically depressed, high unemployment. It's
Right.
a place that had a decent economy and had factories and things back in the 80s, and they just have shut down one at a time, which is a story you can find all across this country.
Mhm.
As the cities have grown and all of the population has drained into the cities, and all of these small towns have just seen their jobs either move overseas, or all of the the service industry jobs, or the intellectual type, office type jobs have all moved to the cities or to where universities are, and they've just seen themselves kind of wilt.
Yeah.
So more and more as time has gone on, even though I started these these books 20 years ago, people have seen them more and more as a commentary on like globalization and what it's done to the rural parts of this country, because the symbolism of, you are a young person in a truly hopeless town where you're just watching like storefronts close and degrade and fall apart, and entire neighborhoods that were beautiful in the 60s and 70s are now just crumbling,
Yeah.
and it's all being done to you by forces you don't understand. It's being done by corporations who have their headquarters on the other side of the planet,
Mhm.
and those jobs were shipped to a factory in India or wherever. You don't even know where it went. But the point is that everything that's happening to your town, all of that degradation, is occurring due to forces outside of your control that you don't understand. You don't understand who's manufacturing the fentanyl.
Uh-huh.
You don't understand all of these things that you are the victim of. So the cosmic horror themes that we as humans are just helpless in the face of these hugely powerful entities that we can't even comprehend, people see that as symbolism, because it's like, yeah, that's what they're actually living. But it doesn't need to be that. I think it's a universal experience of anybody living in a small village anywhere. Right now there's some teenagers living in a village in India that I'm sure feel the exact same way, that they,
Yeah.
that we've been abandoned here and we don't have control over our lives, because our fates are in the hands of total strangers 5,000 miles away.
Wow, I hadn't actually thought of any of those books in that way, but now I do see it versus since we're on the subject of symbolism and everything, I do see the Zoey Ashe novels in a certain sort of light. You've been talking about TikTok and being online and everything like that, and in futuristic violence and fancy suits, and Zoe punches the future in the dick, and now in Zoe is too drunk for this dystopia, you have invented Blink, which is essentially just a giant version of always on TikTok slash YouTube slash kind of a surveillance state. And I read it and I think to myself, this is a little bit scary, but also a very believable future, because Zoe's books are set quote unquote in the not too distant future. And I'm like, oh, this is a scary yet very believable outcome for the world, because a lot of times when people write about the future, they either write about like a Star Trek utopia or a Mad Max hellscape, and you're kind of somewhere in the middle where you're like, it's not that much different than now, except some of these things here have changed that are either awesome or not awesome, but the world is still somewhere right in the middle.
And all science fiction set in the future is secretly about the present, right?
Right.
So when you're trying to, in this case, I wanted a future where the cars are still on the ground. You don't have sentient robots. That's something I think is actually very far away.
I do too.
Um,
Mhm.
but you have self-driving cars and you have a social media network. And this was the big thing because I was confident that this will exist in my lifetime, where basically they've made cameras small enough that you could just pin them to your clothes.
Mhm.
There's the size of buttons, and they just live stream your life all day. And then they've just got software in them that detects, that goes up and zooms in on points of interest. So you're not having to operate the camera, it just does it. So then Blink, as a user, you can hop to any of these live feeds, any camera that's pinned to somebody's body, any
Mhm.
camera that's mounted outdoors, or any traffic camera, any drone. There's all these hobby drones flying everywhere, these which are just tiny, sparrow type drones.
Yes.
So you as a user basically have a God's eye view of the world as long as there's a camera nearby. And so if there's an event in this universe, like if there's a crime, there's a mass shooting or something happens in the middle of a city, and you've got 500 bystanders, you have 500 views of it. And you may have 10 drones overhead. You may have security cameras. You may have cameras on dashboards of every car now has a camera.
Mhm.
And you can blink as you can just hop from feed to feed to feed and watch it happen real time. You basically have an omniscient view of the world.
Yeah.
But that means that every single person living in that society has to assume they're on camera every moment they're outside their home.
Mhm.
So the question that these books ask, on top of others, is how does that affect your behavior? Because already now you kind of assume that you could be on camera. But for example, I think most people will still go to a restaurant and have a conversation with their friends and assume that it is private.
Sure.
Or if you're having an argument on a sidewalk, like it's conceivable somebody could pull out their phone and record you, but you still assume, like if you're having a bitter argument about your job on a street corner, you assume that's just between the two of you.
Mhm.
Well, this is a world where, a microphone can pick you up from 100 yards away, or it can pick you up from the sky.
Yeah.
So the concept of there's no longer such a thing as private behavior unless you're in the home. And if you're in the home, you have to be sure there's not somebody there with a camera. How does that change how people behave? How does that change? Because already with the social media era, we've seen such a fundamental difference in how people talk to each other. Because how do people talk to each other when they're in private versus how do people talk to each other when they know they have an audience
Sure.
is radically different, because now it's a performance. Now, in any kind of a disagreement, there is no way you can back down because you're in a prize fight. You're in a ring with people
Mhm.
cheering you on, whereas privately between two people, you could work things out. So this is a world where she finds herself in very kind of high stakes conflict. She winds up at the head of a crime family through no fault of her own. That all of these conflicts play out with this gamesmanship of people trying to get the public on their side with everything they do in public. Everything, what they eat, how they dress, everything is being judged.
Yeah.
And when you ask what does that do to a human mind, I think it's not trivial. I'm not trying to scare people about the technology, but I think it fundamentally changes the dynamic.
Yeah, and you illustrate that really well because even though Zoe exists in that world, when she's poor before she becomes the head of this company slash crime family, she doesn't think about necessarily the way this reflects, how she looks, how what she's doing reflects on anything. And then she meets the Suits, the of futuristic violence and fancy suits fame, and she all of a sudden has the character Will in her ear all the time going, well, you can't do that, it will look this way. And in Zoe, the new one, Zoe is too drunk for this dystopia, it's about an election and she can't be seen to do anything that might tip this entire city towards electing the wrong guy for mayor because everything she does every moment of the day is on camera. And so that really did make me think about not just how being on camera all the time affects how you act, but also how positions of power might have to make you act.
Yeah, and this is part of what these stories about, is someone who grew up without any power. She grew up at the start of the first book. She's living in a trailer park with her mother.
Hmm.
And then she finds out, to spoil the first quarter of the book, she finds out that she has come into this inheritance where basically her estranged father, her biological father, who she had no relationship with, was a Bugsy Siegel type, someone who had legitimate interests in terms of real estate and casinos, but also was heavily mobbed up. Just
Hmm.
tons of, just heavily involved in organized crime, very paranoid. And for mysterious reasons, when he passes, he leaves everything to her, everything, all of his properties, all of his money, all of his employees now work for her. So this just lands in her lap. So she's someone who had grown up basically outside of capitalism, having no stake in that game. She's
Right.
someone who had been abandoned by it. Her mother has no money, and then suddenly finds herself at the wheel of capitalism. Suddenly finds herself in one of the positions where she can make a difference in people's lives, and then instantly finds out that it's not that easy, and especially not that easy to be a good person in that situation.
Yeah.
So everything about what she does, there's two layers to it. There's what actually is going to affect things, but there's also how she comes across, because to what degree does she want to be the face of this organization? Or
Mhm.
did her father secretly make her the face of this organization to try to whitewash what they were doing, because they knew she would seem sympathetic? She's this young woman. She's kind of sarcastic and funny, and she came from nothing. It's like, did he just throw this in her lap specifically to, like, put a different face on what he was doing? And
Right.
if so, then what is her responsibility? What is your responsibility as a cog in a machine where you are benefiting greatly from the machine? She has all the wealth, but also there's no real way to extricate herself from it. So in some ways, it's kind of what we all have to face, where you grow up in a very privileged society, but it got here by oppressing a whole bunch of people. So it's like, well,
Yeah.
what is your responsibility to give back, or how do you make it right when every single day that you walk around, you are benefiting from the society and its infrastructure and everything else? It's kind of that, only blown up to a crazy degree.
Oh, sure. And even though we're talking about these books in this manner, that even though they're wildly entertaining, they're sci-fi, they're horror, um, they're comedy. The Zoey books especially have made me really not that this isn't something I do anyway, but like you just said, I think about sometimes how I am the cog in the machine and how even higher up than me, somebody might be thinking, well, if I do this, then a bunch of people, because Zoe wants everything to have a good black and white answer where she's like, I just want to do the right thing. And then there's somebody there going, well, if you do that thing and it is the right thing and we shut down this portion of our business, all these people over here are going to lose their jobs. And, maybe they'll end up in sex work, or maybe they'll end up homeless, and maybe they won't be able to feed their children and all that kind of thing. And so it does make me, while I'm reading these books, I think about that, and it's a marker. I always say, if the purpose of art is to make you think, then these books especially are doing a job, doing a good job at that.
I try very hard to make it, all of the books I write, something that you can enjoy, hopefully,
Mhm.
on any level, because they are adventures and they are in some ways very ridiculous.
Oh,
And the in
yes.
the Zoe Ashe books, will be the third. They're episodic. You could technically read them in any order if you wanted to, but the the way people act when they all believe they're performing, and especially the posturing among the men in a society where they feel like they
Uh-huh.
have to really demonstrate how big and tough they are, and how over the top they get, is truly ridiculous. And it's comical because you can see right through these people and how they're all trying to puff themselves up and all trying to create a brand or an image for themselves. And it's very silly, but at the same time, science fiction should always be about trying to make you think about something. And
Yes.
one of my go-to examples is the film RoboCop. That is a
Oh.
film that is literally called RoboCop.
Yeah.
That is a title like you would expect from an asylum film, like one of
Yep.
those cheap knockoffs you see in the DVD bin at the grocery store. Like, it's called RoboCop. But it is this great action, bloody blood and gore action story. You can enjoy it on that level, but also it's got tons of satire about the Reagan era, about privatization, and also has this incredibly incisive through line about dehumanization and trying to cling to your humanity. And the
Hmm.
whole thing where he has a helmet that covers his face, and that's to symbolize that he's part machine and part human.
Yeah.
And then at the end, they have to take it off, and it exposes his full face, and he starts to recover his own memories and try to reclaim himself from this corporation, from this the machine that brought him back to life. The
Mhm.
corporation gave him, like they gave him his body. He is benefiting from the strong body that the corporation built for him, but trying not to lose his humanity. Like there are actual Oscar winning smart movies that don't get to the heart of that as well as RoboCop does.
Yeah, it's wild.
So I try to do the same thing. I am not claiming I am as talented as Paul Verhoeven or anyone involved in that, but I try to do the same thing because every single minute of Zoe's life is a dilemma. So, like
Hmm.
you mentioned, her father being a crime lord and being a crime lord in what is basically this takes place in a fictional city that happened the way Las Vegas happened in the 1950s, 1960s, where Las Vegas used to be a tiny town in the middle of the desert.
Yep.
And then Bugsy Siegel and a few other investors just built a casino in the middle of nowhere. And then it just sprang up like in the middle of the desert. Like it's the worst
Right.
place to put something.
Yes.
And so that's all they've done here is they decided that they basically built what libertarians call a charter city. Like let's
Uh-huh.
go out in the middle of nowhere and build a new city under our rules where the state government will let us do our own thing and as a proof of concept that our way of governing works. So in the
Mhm.
world of these books, somebody has built a Dubai type city full of skyscrapers in the middle of Utah. But
Yes.
right now there's hardly anything there. Just a little there's some cool little small towns and hiking there right now. And so they have built basically this new Las Vegas, but it's a very lawless place because that was the idea, is that they wanted to prove that you could have, if it's just all capital and businesses and private security and you privatize everything, this can work. If you get enough money all in one place, it can work. And
Hmm.
of course, it does not. It's a
No.
catastrophe, but it's a lawless comical place. And so her father being this type also has lots and lots of sex workers. Zoe is in favor of sex work conceptually. Her mother was a sex worker for a while.
Hmm.
She does not approve of anyone who tries to dehumanize that work. And also, some of these women were straight up trafficked. Some of them were stolen from the countries they're from. Some of
Yes.
them came here as refugees and were basically locked into doing the work because they had their passports taken and were told they had to work off a debt, which is a real thing that happens with human trafficking. It is
Hmm.
so you have in her father's employ women who were basically kidnapped into it, women who were underage, but also women who are charging $5,000 per date and are making good money and love it. And so having the black and white decision of, okay, I'm going to get out of sex work, or I'm just going to get rid of all of this. I don't approve of the way, like it, in many of these cases, she realizes a lot of these women are working to pay off their addictions. They're only
Hmm.
working to because they're addicts.
Yeah.
Realizing that fixing that problem is not as simple as writing them a check or sending them to rehab or doing whatever. This is what weighs on her because it's like, well, but we are perpetuating this problem. Like we are part of the machine. It's like, yeah, you sure are. What do you want to do? And so at every step, she tries. But if you say, well, we're going to drug test everybody, and if you fail, then we're going to fire you from the brothels. Okay, so now they're on the street.
Yeah.
So now they don't have the protection of your organization. Now they're out on their own. They're independent. They're going to go work for a guy, or else they're going to go scatter on their own, where their chances of being murdered goes up something like 10,000%. You know, uh, it's like, well, then what am I supposed to do? And that's what these books are about, because it's not none of these solutions are as easy as they sound from the outside, and
Yeah.
it's not to excuse the billionaires of the world. It's like, see, they're doing their best. It's to point out that this system has a way of making everyone as an individual feel powerless in the machine.
Hmm.
So in her case, she keeps running up against this thing of like, well, but the people, there's certain demand for certain things, and somebody's going to provide it. So what do? You have a place where the law is not going to help you. So what do you do? And that's what she keeps trying to tackle. Because in many ways, there's the element of the wish fulfillment story where somebody comes into money and finds out they're basically royalty.
Oh yeah.
But it's also like now you're to blame for what people are going through, because now you are in a position of extreme privilege. So now how do you
Hmm.
deal with that? And it's very, this is the whole thing. It's very difficult for her because she would not go back. She doesn't want to go back to the trailer park,
Right.
but also this is something she truly doesn't know how to navigate.
Right. And just because we talked a little bit about, you talked about how, you want to make everything also an adventure and all kinds of stuff, and sometimes things are ridiculous. I don't want to give away, but there is something in the most recent book that comes from, there's an incident, I'll just say, in a factory, and you'll know what I'm talking about, and people that don't read but there's an incident that is an inciting incident where something totally ridiculous happens, and it's that thing like you just said, where Zoe is kind of faced with just another problem that comes from her situation in life, and from people viewing her as the source of problems, where now she's not actually done anything wrong, but because somebody views her as the source of a problem, she has to deal with the fallout of that.
And to be clear, they're not wrong. This is part of what she's has to come to terms with, is that she is in a position to help. And if she doesn't help,
Mhm.
then that's the same as having done the harm.
Yes.
And this is what the discussion about things like privilege, the way people talk online about politics, anything like this, can be so frustrating because nobody enjoys hearing, well, like, you have privilege, you have a responsibility to use your privilege as a white man or as whatever to try to lift up
Mhm.
people and lift up voices and try to do and try to help. And it's like, it, you know, it, people hear that and they can always say, look, I'm working 60 hours a week. I pay my taxes. I don't commit any crimes. Like, what else do you want from me? What else do you want?
Mhm.
And so with her, it's just in a very extreme version of that, where it's like, well, yeah, I technically have $1 billion+ in assets. I technically employ how many tens of thousands of people. But what do you want me to do? How do you want me to stop all the crime that's going on? How do you want me to stop the homelessness? It's like, well, you could have bought all these people homes.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, yeah, like technically, but also a lot of them are addicts. They don't know how to maintain a home. So it's like, well, you could have hired someone to maintain their home for them. It's like, yeah, but they need, a lot of them are severely mentally ill. They shouldn't be living on their own. It's like, well, you should have built a facility to,
Yeah.
and then so you try to do that, and then you're running up against like zoning issues and the legalities of being able to build a place. So I think she's gotten to a place where she's trying to not let her own sense of helplessness get in the way of the reality of what she can still do. Because
Mhm.
again, the world will try to trick you into believing that you can't do anything, when in reality, everybody can do something.
Right.
She just has a cartoonishly outsized version of that dilemma.
Yes. I want to ask you a question, just because there's a difference in style between, which obviously they're different stories, they're about different characters, but there is a difference in style between the John Dies at the End series and the Zoe series, in that the John Dies at the End series is very ridiculous, kind of, full of immature humor, and it's a little out there and everything. And the Zoe series is still very funny and everything, but it's more grounded, more believable. When you went in, was there any sort of intention that you were going to write the new series in a different style than you had been writing, or did that just come from the story itself?
Yeah, it was a chance to do something different. But the story, the tone of John Dies at the End comes from mainly from the protagonist, because it's very much, for the most part, seen from his point of view, and it's a very strict first person perspective. And he and his friends are from this place where they have an extremely profane sense of humor
Mhm.
because of just where they're from and like this is the most politically incorrect place on earth.
Yeah.
They are a place with that is very poor, high unemployment, that is very rural, and it's also from a part there's just a cultural tone that is from the part of the Midwest that's not the polite part of the Midwest. If you're from there, you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That it goes to there's just America has different vibes based on where you go, and this place is kind of like the opposite of California. It's the opposite of laid back. It is very so in his mind. This is someone who is an extreme misanthrope. This is someone in David, the narrator, who is extremely intelligent, but not in any way that helps him or anyone else.
Yeah.
He can just instantly have observations about what's ridiculous about a situation, and the phrasing and the turns of phrase and the way he sees things, the way he describes things, the way he will see an object and things like that, and the way it is described in his mind as he'll compare it to looking like blank, and it's always something ludicrous. So
Yeah.
there's something ridiculous every other sentence in those books because it just is very, very rapid fire. I think some young person reading those books today, unfortunately, would say, "Oh, this is Rick and Morty.
Mm.
This is two guys. You've got kind of different personalities. One is kind of like laid back. One of them is kind of just plunge ahead into the adventure, and it's rapid fire. It's almost cartoonish and how fast it goes, how quickly
Mm.
the jokes come incredibly fast. It's slapstick. It's very gory and profane.
Yeah.
But like Rick and Morty, it's always based around some sort of abstract thought experiment type horror concept. So it's very smart, but it's a smart idea, but the characters are all stupid, so they don't know how to think about it. So there's like something smart happening, but the protagonists aren't smart enough to comprehend it. So their narration and their thoughts are very extremely stupid. So it's a
Yeah.
combination of very low humor and very high idea. They did not steal it from me. I'm just saying
Yeah.
I wrote this way before Rick and Morty came along. That if we made a show, a John Dysdian show, I think the first thing somebody would say is, "Oh, they've ripped off Rick. They're doing a live action Rick and Morty. It's
Mhm.
creatures coming out of other dimensions. It's dimension hopping. It's multiverse stuff, and it's very crude in its humor, but it's also very thoughtful in what's happening and all that.
Yeah.
So I would never go out and tell people, oh, if you like Rick and Morty, you should buy my books because that sounds stupid coming out of my mouth, but also it's absolutely true.
It is though.
It
I
is
know you
a
can.
very similar tone.
Yeah, I wouldn't fault you for saying that. You say it sounds stupid coming out of your mouth, but I can see where you would say that, but also like, yeah, they're kind of the same. Like you said, it's not like they necessarily stole it from, but they are kind of the same thing. Where except I would say that in your books, you also have the addition of some other the girlfriend characters and everything like that that kind of separated out. And also one none of it, I don't think either David you say is very smart, but not in any way that helps him. But he's still I still don't think he's necessarily like none of especially he and John are not geniuses. So
Yeah, their actions, like none of their intelligence translates to their actions, but they
right.
know like a lot of trivia, and they always know they're always quick with a remark or with a funny line or
Hmm.
whatever. But that's as much intelligence that they have in terms of their decision making. It doesn't help. Another way to describe it would be like if it's Stranger Things, but if you came back to the Stranger Things kids like 10 years later and they were all like alcoholics
Yeah.
and burn out, and the town had fallen down around them, and the businesses had moved away, and it's just like a
Yeah.
very and they had just completely given up on everything and just had a very misanthropic view of life. It's kind of that. It's kind of it's Stranger Things after everyone has burned out and given up on life. But anyway, how that contrasts with Zoe, there it's a very different protagonist. So you're
Hmm.
hearing again, it's from Zoe's point of view, almost strictly within her point of view, and she just has a different worldview. Like she's very
Sure.
sarcastic. She has those defense mechanisms. She was kind of picked on growing up, but it's a world that's a little bit more serious. It's a world that is not again, there's no supernatural in the Zoe world. It takes
Right.
place in our universe. Basically, it's just an alternate timeline where somebody had built a huge city of the future in the desert, which, by the way, there are multiple billionaires trying to do this. I didn't pull that idea out of my butt. It's something that
Okay.
many billionaires, they're trying to buy up land in different parts of California, just any place where they've got someplace where they've got a governor or a local county and state government that kind of would let them do it and doesn't would let them let them kind of,
Hmm.
with the idea that it'll attract enough businesses and bring in a bunch of tax revenue or whatever.
Huh.
So that's a thing that someday will exist. Um, but it is because it's seen through the eyes of a protagonist who's coming at it from a different perspective. You just don't get as, for me, that's how you judge the tone of a book. It's the voice of the protagonist. You're seeing it through their eyes,
Right.
and so it's not like total slapstick craziness, but it's more, it's, again, it's obviously not dead serious. There's heavy elements of satire, but it's not goofy. If some people are worried about books being too jokey or whatever, it's
Yeah.
not like that.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. And one of the other things I am interested in, just I pay a lot of attention to stand-up comedy and obviously writing jokes. Everybody thinks that there's people, you're just naturally funny like that. And people are naturally funny and quick-witted, but also a lot of writing goes into jokes. When you set out to write one of your books, are you planning jokes ahead of time? Are you looking at your plot and where that's coming from and kind of trying different things in the humor, or is that or do you not think about it too much and then they kind of just arise naturally?
Well, here's the funny thing. I can only write in a humorous tone. If I try to write in a
Oh,
dead
okay.
serious tone, I find it boring. So, like, I got my writing training, writing, blogging online, as I mentioned, in the late 90s.
Mhm,
And at the time, there was a whole range of comedy blogs that most of them are gone now. Some
mhm,
of them are still around, but it was a style that was very appealing to people that were very attention starved in terms of, or like, did
mhm.
not have long attention spans. So it was extremely dense in terms of its writing, in terms of the jokes, in terms of, you would have multiple jokes in one sentence, you would have a punchline every other sentence. It's a very quick style, so that you would still have long form. You would have articles that went on for 4,000 words or whatever, but
Yeah.
it was very rapid fire. And it was a style where I will rewrite a paragraph between 5 and 20 times before it finally goes out to the audience. It's
Okay.
rewriting, 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 making it more and more compact, adding more and more funny lines and rephrasing jokes, getting the word choice just right. It is just endless editing on top of editing on top of editing. And that's where I learned to write. It's just the scene at the time in the internet blogging scene. That's kind of what comedy sounded like. So that's what my writing sounds like, and that's where it came from.
All
So when
right.
I'm writing, I heavily outline in advance because I
Mhm.
have to know. I don't have the attention span to just sit down and, like a freight train, like drive from here to there in the plot. Like George R. R. Martin says, he just like discovers where the plot takes him. I can't do that
Mhm.
because my mind will just wander off to God knows where. You have no
Right.
idea where that train would wind up, but it not at the ending of the story. It would be
Uh-huh.
some totally other story. I would wind up following some other character home, and we would just be talking about their life for it. And then I have to remember, wait, now what was this about? So I have to heavily outline. So I do tons and tons of prep work
Okay.
in advance, which a lot of authors say they would never do this. Like, there's a lot of them that it's straight up advised, you should not do this. For me, it's the only way I can write something that's long form, is to have it completely outlined, know exactly
Mhm.
what's going to happen to the plot. So in terms of the jokes and comedy beats, there are these big set pieces of, like, a big ridiculous slapstick thing that's going to happen,
Yes.
and that's planned in advance. But then you have the actual writing, the actual text of it, and then the everything leading up there. And then within that text, you have there's humor in the text. Like, ideally, when somebody walks through their front door of their home, they're noticing something funny about the front door. They're noticing something funny about the welcome mat. They're
Mhm.
they're making an observation about So that's in these stories, that's what carries you from moment to moment. And then the big stupid moments are things that I have planned. And then the John dies at the end series, like the monster designs and stuff like that, that's all, there's something weird about everything that's kind of like striking or goofy or wrong, and everything is
Mhm.
kind of askew. But then if you're just sitting down to try to plot out, okay, I just have to get the characters from here to that house,
Mhm.
a lot of the thinking is like, what's something amusing about how they can get there?
Okay.
Like, what's something fun about? And so that's part of what takes. I'm a slow writer. It takes a long time to write these books, and that's a lot of it is trying to go back over and over because I don't want there to be a boring sentence in the book, because I'm used to writing for the internet
Sure.
where people had infinite options. They hadn't paid to read it, so they weren't. It wasn't like you paid $30 for a book. It's like, well, I'm going to stick through it and see where it goes. Like I was writing in a day when they clicked on it, they could easily click away. You have pornography in the next tab at any
Yeah.
moment. And so, yeah, someone who was not invested in it, you have to keep them invested sentence to sentence.
Mhm.
And that's, again, I'm not telling anybody that's how you have to write or that's the right way to write. That's what I was raised
That's
on.
what
That
works
that
for
my
you. Yeah.
formative years as a writer, that's where I was doing it.
Well, and you talk about plotting and you say that it takes you a long time to write a book, but you also brought up somebody that doesn't plot their book and that you are definitely not like, and that is George R. R. Martin. So you can at least say you've put out more books recently than he has.
But and the thing is, and not to get off on a George R. R. Martin tangent, but the
No,
fans get
I
so
did it. I did it.
frustrated.
It's my
The
bad.
fans get so frustrated with him, and they will talk about him like he's lazy.
Hmm.
He's not lazy. He's always working.
Yes.
Always. He has so much stuff going. He
Hmm.
has multiple TV shows he's got in development. He's constantly having to give feedback on this stuff. He's got these other
Hmm.
compilations he edits. He's got these side books he writes. He's got,
Hmm.
like, I don't think people understand that, Game of Thrones is like $1 billion brand.
Yeah.
It's now it's got another team. There's another show. There's
Yep.
multiple shows in development. There's another show going on, and stuff where he's involved creatively, or they're asking him, like, I don't know what his exact role is as a consultant, as a producer, whatever. I know he's got his name on it. He wrote Elden Ring, the game. Like, he
Hmm.
has a billion things going on. I hope I'm not having to work that much at his age. It's clear he loves to do it.
Yes.
It's also clear that he's lost interest in A Song of Ice and Fire,
Yeah.
because I can easily see why, because it the ending is already out there. It's
Hmm.
like if you start to tell a joke at a party, and one of the people you're telling it to says, "Oh, I've heard this. The priest says you didn't come here and hunt, did you?" And then because he blew the punchline, nobody laughs because he just said it. He didn't time it or anything. And then everybody's like, "Oh, yeah, it's kind of funny." And
Hmm.
then people look at you like, "Well, finish the joke." It's like, what? No, you've already, where
Yeah.
he ruined it by telling you the punchline, and he said it wrong. There's no way I can phrase the punchline that's going to hit the way it would have
Hmm.
if I had just done it right, releasing a book every 3 years, the way I had been, and then boom, and then you're all on the edge of your seat, finding out, is Jon Snow going to come back? What happens to Stannis? What happened to all of these people? It's what's going to happen to White Walkers? And it's like if you're an author and the whole world is waiting to find out, and that
Yeah.
energy you get up every day, it's like they are going to die when they see this. They're going to die when they find
Hmm.
out that it's John, that is actually the offspring of whatever. Now that that's already out there and been discussed to death, what motivation would you have? Not money. He doesn't need the money.
No.
He's got more money than he can spend. So what motivation do you have to finish it? And you can
Right.
say, like, well, yeah, but doesn't he want to have his own version of it out there? I cannot imagine that would provide me even 10% of the energy that I would need to finish one of these books, because it takes so much energy to write even a short book. And these books are long as hell.
Hmm.
It takes so much to drag yourself to sit there at the typewriter day after day after day after day and grind through it one word at a time to write this freaking 300,000 word long document, and then edit it, and then make sure all the continuity lines up with these books that you
Yeah.
wrote 20 years ago. The first one came out when, 1990 something.
Something like that. Yeah.
Like, there's so much labor, and it takes so much energy and desire and creative desire to see something like that through, I can't imagine that he has it in him to finish that series. I can't imagine.
No, I can't either. And people that aren't creative, kind of don't understand what you were just talking about. The energy it takes, you have to keep up your passion for it. And it's especially if somebody's super creative and is doing multiple projects at once. It's like I make the joke all the time, not mean spirited, but when Guillermo del Toro says he has interest in doing something, I'm like, yes, but Guillermo del Toro is interested in doing everything. If he got to every project he says he wants to do, the man would have to live 150 more years or something like, and probably in those 150 years he'd find more projects he wanted to do. So I totally get it, you know.
And in all of these creative things, where you're talking about writing a book or making a movie, the fun part is one tiny little sliver of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fun part is sitting around dreaming up the ideas, dreaming up the really cool scenes, but
Yep.
then there's the actual brick and mortar work. And so in the film business, and if he puts out somewhere, it's like, well, yeah, I would like to make a whatever, a James Bond movie, a Guillermo del Toro James Bond film. Like he could say that, but the actual act of going through the casting and
Oh
dealing with the
yeah.
people who own that property, and substitute this with anything. He says he wants to make a Godzilla movie or whatever. It doesn't matter. The actual art of making a film, like 5% of it is the cool stuff where it's you and the camera and the actors and you're bringing it to life. The
Mm-hmm.
other 95+% is business and conference calls
Yeah.
and all of this business stuff and arrangements with and auditioning and working with actors and then having to go back and forth about how much control do they want over the script and fighting with the studio over budget and cutting cost and where are we
Mm-hmm.
going to shoot and on and on and on and on. So finding something and then actually committing to it, so you can have somebody like Quentin Tarantino say, I would like to make a Star Trek movie.
Yeah.
Well, that's easy to say that in an
Mm-hmm.
interview. You can say it took no effort to say that. The actual act of settling down on a project and saying, this is going to be the next 2 years of my life, this movie. This is
Yes.
going to consume everything. This is it. That's hard. That's hard. You got a million things you would love to do, but finally zeroing in on one, you have to be so sure that's the one because that's
Mm-hmm.
going to suck the life out of you. And you may spend 2 years putting everything into it, everything you have, heart, mind, body, soul, and then it will come out and nobody will care. It'll
Yeah.
bomb at the box office. The reviews will be like, and then it'll go up on streaming and it'll be up on HBO Max on a thumbnail, but next to a bunch of reality show junk because Max just mixes it all up together. So it's your movie that
Mm-hmm.
you bled for 2 years next to like the Love Island or whatever. And they've got
Yeah.
300 episodes of some corny, reality show. That has to be so dispiriting. So, because again, making a movie is not like when I make a TikTok where I can spend 15 minutes making it and it's out there and either it does something or it doesn't. Like
Mm-hmm.
making a movie, writing a novel, any of these things, once you commit to it and you know that that's going to suck years out of your life, and then you have to sit there and not know if anybody's going to care. Like the world could just be totally indifferent to it. Nobody discusses it. Nobody
Yeah.
cares about it. Nobody talks about it. Yeah, most stuff doesn't get done because it's so easy to say it's not worth it. You have to
Yeah.
find the one thing that you know is worth it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say is I want to be respectful of your time and everything, Jason. So I'm going to start wrapping up here. One thing I can definitely say is worth it is everybody can pick up all the John Dies at the End books and all of the Zoey Ashe novels. You were talking earlier about fans just waiting for things, and I was waiting for Zoey is too drunk for this dystopia because I knew it was coming, and so I was very thankful that I got to read it and talk to you a little bit about it and about your work. So please let everybody know when Zoey's most recent adventure is available, and just plug anything else you want to plug.
Sure. The book is, we keep saying, Zoey is too drunk for this dystopia. It is out October 31st. If you're listening to this after that date, it should be out in all formats, audio, ebook, all of them, hardcover. The first two books, the first one is called Futuristic Violence and Fancy Suits. The second one is called Zoey Punches the Future in the Dick. Both of those are actually on Kindle Unlimited. If you're an
Mhm.
ebook reader, if you got a Kindle Unlimited subscription, you can read those for free. Otherwise, they're available in audio, or you could probably find them at a library or a used bookstore, whatever is the cheapest possible option. I don't care. Things are too expensive. The new one is expensive. I'm sorry, that's just what stuff costs now. But the first two you should be able to get for not very much money. But you can also start with just this one.
Yeah.
If for some unfathomable reason you only want to read the most expensive one, these books all explain at the start what's going on. I never
Yes.
want it to be. I will never probably write a serial story where you have to have read the first 8 books to figure out what's going on in
Mm.
book 9. That's not my
Yeah.
thing. It's like a James Bond adventure or something that starts out,
Yeah.
it reestablishes who's who, and then we launch into it. It is not.
Yep.
These books do not end in a cliffhanger. They're all their own contained stories.
Yes.
Otherwise, if you want to keep up with me outside of the books, I am Jason K. Pargin. Pargin is the last name. On TikTok, where I have 300 some thousand followers at this
Oh,
point.
wow. Yeah. Yeah.
Same username on Twitter, X, and Instagram, and Threads, and Blue Sky,
There's so
and
many now.
YouTube, and Facebook, and I have 2 other Facebook pages, and I'm also on Goodreads. There's others. Oh, I'm on Substack, same username, Jason K. Pargin. Uh, all of the platforms, I think, except for Snapchat, I'm the same username, and I operate all of those myself. I do not have a social media team. Everything you see posted, it is something I posted.
Wow. That is another full-time job in and of itself.
Yes,
Very
that is
cool.
most of my life is promoting the books, because,
Yeah.
as I've said, writing a book is difficult. Getting people to find out about it
Yes.
in this media environment where 1,000 books a day are being written, most of them for free on the internet,
Yeah.
that is the hard part. So yes, I everyone
Well,
who
yeah.
makes shows like yours and listens to shows like yours, I appreciate you, because you are
Yeah.
one of the few vectors of telling people, hey, new book.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad I got to help you say that a new book was coming out. And like I said, I hope people maybe that just tuned in because they were interested in an author interview will go ahead and find the rest of your books if they have not. So thank you so much, Jason, for joining me today.
Thank you.